Welcome to part 2 of the AI podcast and automation series. In the last video, we looked at some of the results after 2 months of launching my totally AI-generated podcast, The AI Briefing. And we discussed why I actually wanted to do this little AI podcast experiment in the first place. But in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I used AI for the planning stages of launching the AI Briefing, and how you can brainstorm, plan, and even create content for your own podcast using AI. Let's dive in. All right, so the first step in launching your podcast is finding your niche or the main topic that the show is going to be about. In my case, I already had a pretty good idea of what I wanted the show to consist of, but if this is the part that's holding you back right out of the gate, here's how you can use AI to help with the brainstorming process. So open up a new chat in whatever AI platform you prefer to use. This could be ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, whatever AI you prefer. I tend to bounce between all three of those just to get different perspectives and views from the different AI platforms themselves. For the case of the AI briefing, I used Gemini for a lot of this planning process. So we're going to use Gemini for a lot of the examples shown here today, but you can use whatever AI platform you prefer best. So to start, we need to let the AI know what we're looking to accomplish and how we want it to help us. We're going to say, help me come up with ideas for a new podcast I want to launch in the blank industry. This is where you fill in whatever topics you are interested in, things that you enjoy doing, whatever topic you think that you could potentially do a podcast on and talk endlessly about. This prompt is nothing crazy, and it goes without saying you can tweak this however you want. We really just want to get that brainstorm process started so that we can expand on some of the ideas that AI gives us. Give the AI as much detail as you can about your thoughts on the show before hitting submit on this prompt. The more details and the more specific you can be upfront, the better results you're going to get out of any AI platform. Here I just said, help me come up with ideas for a new podcast I want to launch in the lawn care industry. And you can see Gemini did a pretty good job of giving us some pretty cool options for what we could potentially do a podcast on. We have a conversational podcast interview with lawn care professionals. We have practical educational podcasts offering seasonal lawn care advice, do-it-yourself tutorials, news and trend podcasts discussing the latest development in lawn care technology. So we got all kinds of different options to run with. And we can mix and match different ideas from what AI gave us, or we can take those ideas and run with them in a completely different direction. But this should be able to start get your mind turning and thinking about the different options that you have for launching a podcast. So with your podcast idea chosen, next it's time to come up with a name for your show. In my case, I already had an idea of what I wanted the show to be about, so I started with names. I said, I'm working to complete a podcast that is completely AI generated with human review and an intervention along the way. The podcast will consist of an AI avatar of myself reading the script that AI generates. The main focus for the podcast episode will be to highlight a few major news updates in the world of AI. The podcast will be a brief weekly update, 1 to 5 minutes in total per episode each week. I need help coming up with names for a podcast. Keep the names brief, 1 to 4 words max, and the podcast name should include a relevant keyword that someone might search for and land on our podcast. So once again, you can see in the prompt, I'm setting up the AI to know what exactly it is that I'm talking about. In this first section, the podcast will consist of an AI avatar of myself reading the script, the main focus of the episode, and the structure of the episode. The podcast will be a brief weekly update. Then I said, I need help coming up with names for a podcast. So now I'm giving it the task that I want it to fulfill, and then I'm giving instructions for completing that task. And of course, AI comes up with all different kinds of answers for us. We got names focusing on the quick update format, names emphasizing the unique AI-generated angle, and slightly more playful names. But what you'll see is that the AI briefing is nowhere on this list. And the reason I bring this up is because AI tools like Gemini and ChatGPT, they aren't really do-it-for-you kind of platforms. They're brainstorming assistants. So with the ideas written out in front of me, I was able to start thinking of other names that I could use for the show. Now, none of these names were really calling to me specifically, and I could have sat and pondered that for a while and taken days to actually make a decision, but I want to get this podcast launched as soon as possible. So rather than taking these ideas, I came up with the weekly download. And this was the main name that I had chosen and I had ran with through the entire exercise here. So with the name chosen, even if only temporary, I was ready to start planning out what an actual episode would look like on the show. So like I mentioned before, I already had a pretty good idea of what I was wanting the show to be about, but I thought, why not give it to AI, see if it comes up with even better ideas than what I already have. So I told Gemini, the AI host will be called Mick. Some of the ideas of the topics that he would cover during an episode would include major announcements from large AI companies, new AI tools, ways people, creators, and business owners can use AI, and industry updates and news around the world of AI. Based on this information, what other suggestions do you have for content that could be included? So once again, I'm putting Gemini inside my mind. Where is my thought process already going, and what kind of ideas do I currently have? And then, based on that information, give me more ideas. And Gemini came up with some pretty good ideas, some quirky fun application, AI debates, AI success stories, listener Q&A, AI myths, AI in unexpected places. So once again, using this as an idea generation, a brainstorming partner, this just gave me a few more ideas of different topics that I could include in the episodes. You can obviously take this a lot further and actually dive into one of these ideas to flesh it out a little bit better. So maybe we want to take the AI debate, include a short segment on ethical considerations or controversies within the AI field that adds depth and sparks listener thought. So maybe I come in here and I say, I really like the idea of an AI debate. Help me flesh out what this segment might look like in the episode. And Gemini or whatever AI you're using will likely come up with a few ideas, maybe even come up with a temporary script as a template that you could use. But you can get as deep in the weeds and as specific as you want with these AI tools, which is partially why I like using them so much. So I have the main podcast theme, I have the podcast name, and I have what these episodes are generally going to look like. Next, I said, help me write what would be a podcast show description based on everything we've discussed so far. This description should thoroughly explain what the show is, what it's about, and why a listener should listen. Put emphasis on the short, digestible nature of the show, and be sure to include relevant keywords to make the show more searchable online. Once again, we got these short options. I actually went with the slightly longer option here because I wanted it more for SEO purposes. I want the show to be found. I wasn't going to be doing a ton of social media marketing with the podcast, so I was really going to be reliant on AI. So I essentially took this option number 3 and I set it aside for further refining that I was going to do myself. So once again, I said I'm going with option number 3 with some modifications. Next, help me build out a more detailed persona for Mick. I like what you started above about Mick's delivery. Now let's expand. So back in the previous section where we were coming up with ideas, Gemini gave me some thoughts on Mick's delivery. That got me thinking, yeah, I could really shape the character and persona of who Mick is as a podcast host, since it's going to be AI delivering the podcast. So that was my next step. Now, this likely won't pertain to a lot of you, but the reason I bring it up is because AI got me thinking about stuff that I never would have thought of. And that's the point of using a lot of these AI tools, to get your mind moving in different directions and thinking differently than what you would normally think. So that's as far as I'll dive into that part of the topic. If you are interested in learning more about how I developed Mick's persona, let me know down in the comments. But for the sake of this video, we keep moving on. So we have the name, we have the show description mostly generated for us. Next, we need a cover art. And this is probably what I spent the most time on in this entire process. Partially because AI can take images in so many different directions, and I didn't really have any direction to give it. So I basically said, what would make a good attention-grabbing cover for this podcast? And it started giving me some different ideas, the download, Mick the AI avatar, the eye, and then give me some additional considerations. So I said, generate an image based on the first concept, which was a stylized download bar, like the kind you see for file downloads. The fill area could be bright, contrasting color to grab attention. The weekly download above or below with AI news and updates in a smaller font. Why it works, it's simple, thematically relevant, immediately communicates the core idea of the podcast. I said, okay, cool, let's generate that. And it gave me a couple ideas here, which the images themselves look pretty good, but I wasn't drawn to any of them as a podcast cover. So I said exactly that. These don't really capture the essence of what you explained above. Try generating some more. We got the weekly download and the AI weekly download. I really liked these. Both of these I was a big fan of. So what I ended up doing is I ran with this image and I went into Photoshop and I essentially recreated this in Photoshop. And it does look very similar to what I have right now for the AI briefing. So now AI is giving you a lot of information and a lot to think about at this point. I would recommend sitting with some of this information and going through some of the responses that AI gave you. At this point, you should have a main podcast theme or topic. You should have a potential name or at least an idea for a name at this point. Then you should have a rough draft for your podcast show description. You should have ideas about what an actual episode might look like on your podcast. And you should have some ideas rolling for what your cover art could be for your new show. In the next video, part 3, we'll be looking at how to create AI agents that will be tasked with handling a lot of the script writing and content writing for our podcast. So if that's of interest to you, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, and I'll see you in the next one.